So generosity is giving without expecting anything in return. Any other thoughts? Everybody okay with that definition?
I think also giving more than what you think you can give.
Giving more than what you think you can give. So maybe another word is sacrificially giving, right? Giving not out of the excess, but out of what you need, maybe sometimes. Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts? On that one, everybody good with those? Okay. Caleb, I think it's probably a setting on my phone is probably the issue. It's working now? Woohoo! Welcome to everybody on Facebook. It's been a couple of weeks here at the church with tech stuff. All right, so here I did a quick look, and Oxford Dictionary defines generosity like this: the quality of being kind and showing a readiness to give more of something than is strictly necessary or expected. I would also add in the thing that Lindsay said. That kind of covers Jessica's definition. I would add in what Lindsay said, and that's the without expecting anything in return. Because generosity is a selfless giving. I'm not giving hoping I get something out of this. I'm giving because it's just what I feel like I need to do. And what happens after that doesn't matter. Okay? So we've all kind of experienced this idea of generosity in some way, whether it was someone sharing of their finances during a time of need that we had, someone sharing of their time, their talents, giving to us in some way. We've all kind of experienced, to at least a small degree, this idea of generosity, whether it was somebody we're close to or a complete stranger. I've experienced it from both. People I didn't really know have given and supported us in different ways throughout the years. And I've also experienced it from people that we're close to, supporting us in giving and not expecting anything in return. And so this idea of generosity is important. And as we walk through the book, or chapter 5 of Nehemiah this morning, what we're going to see is this idea of generosity coming up over and over again. Christ also gave generously of his grace and of his truth in his life so that we could experience freedom. And hopefully, as we look at this chapter 5, we'll see that Nehemiah is modeling that very idea for us of giving of what we have, not just the excess, not the overflow, but giving of everything that we have. And hopefully, we're going to see that in life, we should strive to live life generously. That is our goal. If you don't take anything else away from this morning, please take away this idea to live life generously. In other words, being willing to give of what you have without expecting anything else in return. Not giving because you have excess, but giving because it's what's needed by someone else. Because we don't always have excess, but we still have sometimes a way to meet a need. And that's what we should do. Live life generously. All right, with that being said, we'll jump into Nehemiah chapter 5. This is what Nehemiah writes there in verse 1. There was a widespread outcry from the people and their wives against their Jewish countrymen. Some were saying, "We, our sons and our daughters, are numerous. Let us get grain so that we can eat and live." Others were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and homes to get grain during the famine." Still, others were saying, "We have borrowed money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. We and our children are just like our countrymen and their children, yet we are subjecting our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters are already enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and vineyards belong to others." So an issue has arisen in Jerusalem and the surrounding area where people aren't growing food. Now, this is an issue that has arisen because of the focus of the work on the walls. So remember, Nehemiah, very quick recap, Nehemiah was the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. King Artaxerxes is the ruler of the Persian Empire at this point in time. Excuse me. And Nehemiah is his cupbearer, which is an extremely important job. He's very close to the king. He tastes all the food and drink that goes to the king before the king has it to make sure it's not poisoned. So it's kind of a dangerous job, but it's also a very trusted job because the king is trusting that Nehemiah is not lying to him when he hands him his cup of wine or some food. And so the king trusts him. Nehemiah gets a message about Jerusalem and that it's in really bad condition, that the walls are still torn down, so it's unprotected, and that people can come in and raid Jerusalem and the people that live there at any time they desire. And so Nehemiah is heartbroken by this. One, because his ancestors, his relatives, and the place where all of his ancestors are buried is in danger. But two, he also knows something else that's extremely important. Jerusalem is the place that God has selected to be the center of his worship at this time period. And the temple is there, the Holy of Holies, where God meets and communes with his people, is in Jerusalem and is unprotected. And so it concerns him that this place could be torn down once again. And that he also knows that doesn't look good on his God. And so God begins to work in Nehemiah's heart, and he's like, hey, I want you to go take charge and get the walls rebuilt. And he knows that God is calling him to do this. And so he goes to Artaxerxes and ends up, Artaxerxes lets him go back to Jerusalem. And so that kind of is where we're at. Nehemiah is back in Jerusalem. He's the governor of the Judean province. So he's ruling this area, but he's also overseeing and making sure the walls of Jerusalem get rebuilt. Okay, so that's what's going on. That's the background. And in these few verses here, we see that the work is going, that it's progressing well. Last week we learned that it was going, but it was having to go slow because there was a threat of violence against the people trying to rebuild it. And so half of them were on guard with spears. The other half were working, but they were working kind of with their heads up while they were doing stuff so they could see if something was coming. And if attack was coming, they would drop what they were doing, grab their swords, and go. And so they were kind of on the defensive while they're trying to build, so it's slow work. And now, as a result of this focus on the work, a lot of the poorer people of Israel especially are struggling. Because normally they would be in the fields working and harvesting crops, and then they would use these things to feed themselves and their families. But that's not happening because they're working on the wall. And then there's another word in here that she uses, there's a famine, which means there's not enough food anyway because of some kind of whatever. It could be likely because of a drought, and so there's not enough crops to go around to feed everyone. And so there's a shortage of food anyway. They're not growing enough to start with because they're working on the wall. There's a shortage because of the famine. But then we also read about the king's tax. And what would happen here is the king's representatives, King Artaxerxes, he did this throughout his kingdom. This was a standard practice for empires of the day. They would go around to all the farmers and collect a percentage of the produce from that farm, whether it was from their livestock. Typically it was both livestock and things grown in the fields. And then they would gather those things and they would take them back and they would be distributed to the officials of the kingdom. And that was how the officials were fed. That included governors. And we'll get into how that part affected Nehemiah later in the chapter. So you also had all these things going on that are going against the people of Israel. And what we see is that the poorer Israelites are the ones being heavily affected. They're having to take out loans to buy food to eat. Some of them are even having to sell their children into slavery because it's the only way that they can buy food to feed their children and to feed themselves. And they sell them into slavery because, one, they get money to feed themselves, but then the child becomes the responsibility of the one that now owns them, and so now they're feeding them. So it sounds terrible, and it is, but on the parents' end, it was, I'm guaranteeing my child's going to have food. And I'm also going to have food because I've got money to buy food with. The problem here becomes who's doing the buying and selling and who's giving the mortgages and the way they're handling all of that. So this gives us an economic picture, so to speak, of what's happening, and it's not good. People are on the verge of starvation. They're trying to rebuild the wall, but they're hungry. They want to rebuild the wall because that's the command, but they need to go work the fields so they can have food, but they can't do that. And so now they're just without. And they're taking out mortgages because even with that, the king just doesn't care that they haven't grown food. He still wants his food tax met. So they're taking out a mortgage on their land, they're selling their children so that they can pay the king his produce that he is owed. Not to mention so that they can feed themselves. So that's what's happening in these first 5 verses. Word of this makes its way back to Nehemiah, that their own countrymen are the ones loaning the money. So you have the poor Israelites struggling, selling their children, mortgaging everything they do own so that they can feed themselves and their families. And the people that are giving them the money are other Israelites. Well, this sounds okay at first, but let's get into the next few verses and we'll see why this is a big problem. Verse 6, I became extremely angry when I heard their outcry and these complaints. After seriously considering the matter, I accused the nobles and officials, saying to them, each of you is charging his countrymen interest. So I called a large assembly against them and said, we have done our best to buy back our Jewish countrymen who were sold to foreigners. But now you sell your own countrymen, and we have to buy them back. They remained silent and could not say a word. Then I said, what you are doing isn't right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God and not invite the reproach of our foreign enemies? Even I, as well as my brothers and my servants, have been lending them money and grain. Please, let's stop charging this interest. Return their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses to them immediately, along with a percentage of the money, grain, new wine, and fresh oil that you have been assessing them. In other words, give them back their property that they mortgaged and the interest that you charged them. Okay, so give them everything back. Verse 12, they responded, we will return these things and require nothing more from them. We will do as you say. So I summoned the priests and made everyone take an oath to do this. I also shook the folds of my robe and said, may God likewise shake from his house and property everyone who doesn't keep this promise. May he be shaken out and have nothing. The whole assembly said amen, and they praised the Lord. Then the people did as they had promised. So the issue isn't actually the lending of the money. Okay? That's not really the problem. The problem is that they're lending the money and then charging the people interest, knowing that they will never be able to pay it back. So that's the problem. There's another issue with charging interest here that we don't necessarily understand ourselves because most of us aren't well-versed in Jewish law. So, at this time, they were not allowed to charge interest to fellow Israelites. They were allowed to loan money to another Jew, but they weren't allowed to charge them interest. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 19 and 20, this is what it says. Do not charge your brother interest on silver, food, or anything that can earn interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but you must not charge your brother Israelite interest, so that the Lord your God may bless you in everything you do in the land you are entering to possess. So this is part of their law. The nobles and officials of the Israelites are people that should know this, and they charged interest anyway. That is what angers Nehemiah. It's not necessarily the lending of the money that angers him because he knows that allows the people to purchase the food they need. It's the interest that they are charging them. It's the fact that they are willing to accept their children as payment. Because what they do is these nobles are accepting the children of the poorer Israelites as payment, and then they're taking those children and they're selling them into the slave trade. Okay, it's not like they're like, hey, you just come work in our house for a while, and this is how we'll pay you is in food. It's, we'll take your kid, and then we're going to sell your kid, and we're going to keep the money. That's what was happening. And this, rightfully so, angers Nehemiah. because they had just spent all their time while they were in exile and after they've been back from exile trying to get all their people back. A lot of their people had been captured and taken into slavery, and they had spent this time after the exile trying to get everybody back. And we get the idea, it doesn't tell us for sure, but you get the idea from the wording of Nehemiah that maybe they had either gotten really close to being done with that, they'd gotten all the Israelites out of slavery, or they had finished the task and all the Israelites were free. And now here they are, their own countrymen selling them back into slavery. So Nehemiah is rightfully angered. These are people that should know better, that should know the difference. They should know how to live generously, but yet they're choosing to live selfishly. They're choosing to live by what will enrich themselves, and they're doing it at the expense of others. There is nothing wrong with desiring to grow your portfolio, so to speak. Okay? There's nothing wrong with putting money in savings. There's nothing wrong with putting aside money for retirement and these different things. But when it becomes a thing where you're doing that at the expense of someone else, knowing that it's going to harm them, that's when it becomes a problem. When that money becomes your God and you serve it versus you serving God and the money He gives you as a tool to serve others, that's different. When money becomes what you serve, that's a problem. And that's what had happened for some of these officials and nobles. They had begun to serve the money they could make, sadly, the money they could make off their fellow countrymen. And so they were charging interest, they were giving loans that they knew people could never repay so that they could enrich themselves. And Nehemiah, being the leader he is extremely angry. The other thing we see is that Nehemiah doesn't hide the fact that he was also giving loans. But the thing that's different about Nehemiah is that he didn't seem to be charging interest. He was loaning money, but he was doing it within the means of the law. And he wasn't taking children as payment. He wasn't trying to enrich himself off the backs of others. He was giving them the money they needed to survive. But then he realizes that even that in this moment is too much. And what he should be doing is just giving to the people what they need. And so he calls an assembly. He tells the nobles and officials and himself to forgive all the loans. And that's what they do. But because he wants to be sure that this is actually done, he then calls the priest in and goes, we're going to do it, and we're going to say this. We're going to make a promise. We're going to swear in front of the priest that we're going to do this. And then he adds a level of consequence to it. He says, at the end of this, if we don't do this, may God shake everything from us. In other words, may He leave us broken and penniless if we do not do the things we're saying we're going to do, which was returning all the property and all the interest that had been charged to their fellow countrymen. And so they agree to do that, and that's what they do. They finally begin to live life generously. You see, money is one of those things that we struggle with so bad. Some people don't, and there are a handful of people that don't really struggle with it. There's some people that it becomes a concern because maybe they grew up and they didn't have any, and now they've got enough, and they're really careful and hanging on to it, and they don't want to give it to anybody else. Or maybe they grew up and they've always had it, and they don't understand what it means to go without. Maybe you're right in the middle, and you're like, I don't care. Money's money. There's always going to be enough. And I'll be honest, that's probably the best attitude to have. Money's money. It's always going to be there when I need it because I'm going to trust that God's going to provide it. Point of transparency, that is not where I do very well with. I struggle to remember that God is always going to provide. And my wife is great to go, we've always had what we need. I don't always like to hear her say that, but she's always right. That's right, I said it. You're right. You want to record? It's on video right here. The reality is, our attitude towards money affects oftentimes our attitude towards others. So many of us can get caught up on we are better than others because we have more money than others. Some of us get caught up on we're struggling and we're never going to make it because we always barely seem to have enough to get by. Maybe you grew up in a house that's like mine. We weren't completely broke, but we didn't have any money for extra stuff. We had what we needed, and that was really about all. I can remember, it's one of those things as a kid, you don't think about it until you get older, but as I got older and I got on my own, I realized something. I don't remember when I lived at home my parents buying new clothes. I certainly don't remember them going anywhere other than Walmart to buy new clothes. And that was only because the stuff they had broke and they had to replace it. I don't remember them doing those things because honestly, in our house, a lot of times it was either my parents got stuff or we got stuff. And they always bought what their kids needed versus what they might need. And so the money idea, that scarcity, is something that I always struggle with. Even though we now live in a situation where it's like we always have what we need. We rarely have extra, but we always have enough to cover what we need. But because I grew up in that idea of, well, maybe not, I always struggle with remembering that God always provided even when I was a kid. God always provided. And He's going to continue to do that. He's going to always provide. Something, I don't remember who said it to us, but it was something that I'm pretty sure I think Dawn was the first person I heard say it. And I know we heard it somewhere, but I don't remember where. And it was, you always have what you need, nothing more, nothing less. God always provides what you need, nothing more, nothing less. Dr. Burns, one of her professors, I didn't have him for any of my classes, at the Baptist College of Florida, where I got my undergrad from. And Dawn went there for a little bit before she transferred. So, but that was what he always said, is God always provides what you need, nothing more, nothing less. And if I had thought about this while I was writing my notes, I would have put that in the slides, but I didn't. So, sorry. And that's so true. And that is what the Israelites had forgotten. He always provides what you need, nothing more, nothing less. And if He provides more, that's generally because He's putting you into a spot to provide for someone else, to share that extra with someone else because they may need it. And as we meet those needs, we then gain this wonderful privilege of being able to speak truth of Christ and grace and love in the life of someone else. Live life generously. So I mentioned earlier that Nehemiah had this opportunity to be given a food allotment, right? So you had the king's tax, right? I mentioned that earlier, that he would come and he would tax the produce that a farmer made, whether it was stuff from the fields or whether it was from livestock or both. The king would take a portion of that and then distribute it to his officials. Governors were given an allotment of food that they could collect. Nehemiah was the governor of Judah, which means he had the opportunity, he had the privilege to partake in this allotment. But what did he do? Let's look at verses 14 and following and see what he did with that. Furthermore, from the day King Artaxerxes appointed me to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year until his 32nd year, 12 years, I and my associates never ate from the food allotted the governor. The governors who preceded me had heavily burdened the people, taking from them food and wine as well as a pound of silver. Their subordinates also oppressed the people. But because of the fear of God, I didn't do this. Instead, I devoted myself to the construction of this wall, and all my subordinates were gathered there for the work. We didn't buy any land. There were 150 Jews and officials, as well as guests from the surrounding nations at my table. Each day, 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some fowl were prepared for me. An abundance of all kinds of wine was provided every 10 days. But I didn't demand the food allotted to the governor, because the burden of the people was so heavy. Remember me favorably, my God, for all that I have done for this people. All right, so here's some quick math that I didn't do. Thankfully, the commentator that wrote about this chapter that I was reading from, one of them, he did this math for me, so I didn't have to. It was great. 1 oxen a day for 12 years is 4,380 oxen. 6 sheep a day for 12 years is 26,280 sheep served at Nehemiah's table. Okay, that is a lot, just in case you were wondering. That is a lot of oxen. That is a lot of sheep. Why is that important? Because Nehemiah financed it himself. Dude had money. He had plenty of cash from somewhere. It doesn't tell us whether it was his salary as the governor from the time he was cupbearer, whether he had loads and loads of livestock that could sustain this. It doesn't tell us, but we can look at the context clues and figure out that Nehemiah had plenty of money. And so he looked at his wealth and he said, I don't need the allotment of food that's given to me. I have the opportunity to take it. I can. It is a privilege that is afforded to him. And he said, I don't need it. I will provide for myself and all my officials, all 150 people that would gather at his table on a daily basis. He provided for them on his own. And it tells us in that passage that we just read, the reason he did that was because of the fear of God and the burden that the people already had. He looked at his wealth and he said, I have an opportunity to relieve the burden on my people by providing my own food. And so that's what he did. Living life generously is not always easy. It takes sacrifice. Live life generously. Live life generously. You see, Nehemiah knew that he was going to have to sacrifice something in order to relieve the burden on his people. And what he was willing to sacrifice was some of his wealth. Like I said, we don't know if his salary from the king for being governor was just that great or what, or if he just had it, inherited it. We don't know where it came from, but all we know is that he had plenty of wealth, whether it was in livestock or whether it was just in silver and gold. We don't know for sure, but what we know is he was willing to part with it so that his people could have some relief. It was one less tax that they had to pay. Because you would have the governor come and take some, and then the king would come and take some, and the governor had the option to come and take a little bit more if he wanted to, and then his officials could come take a little bit too. And Nehemiah said, we're not going to do that to our people. They're already struggling. And so for 12 years, he financed his own food and his officials' food so his people could have some relief. The other thing that we see happen, or that Nehemiah mentions here, is that even though he was governor and he once again had yet another privilege, he chose to give that privilege up. One privilege would have been just to sit in his palace and direct his people. And he chose not to do that. Now, he looked at his officials and he said, hey, they're working on the wall. You and I are going to go work on the wall too. They took their shifts on the wall, building that wall just like everybody else did. He asked of his people, hey, yes, it's going to be a burden. I'm asking you to sacrifice. I'm asking you to not grow crops and work on the wall. And he says, but I'm not just asking it of you. I'm going to do the same. Rather than sitting and doing the governly things that he should be doing, he also came and worked on the wall. He sacrificed. Because more than likely what that meant for him was when he wasn't on the wall, he was working on governor stuff because governorship had to be done no matter what, which meant late nights for Nehemiah. He'd go work on the wall, he'd come back to his palace, and he'd have to work more. But he wasn't going to ask his people to do something that he wasn't also going to do. Nehemiah was a true leader, and he led through generosity. We are called to live life generously. All of us, each person, especially those of us that call ourselves Christians, we must live with generosity in our hearts. Something beautiful happens when we do this. When we live life generously, when we live with generosity, we join God in the work He is already doing. You see, one of the things that we will often say is, I don't feel God, I don't see God doing anything. But a lot of times the reason we don't see Him doing anything is because we're not looking. God is always at work. He's always working in someone, in the life of somebody, whether it's you, usually it's you, just to be honest with you, and those around you. And when we choose to live with generosity, we open our eyes and we open our hearts and we begin to see what God is doing all around us. And that is a beautiful thing when we truly experience it. And then we get the privilege to go and join Him. Not because He needs us, because He definitely does not. If anything, we make His job harder. But because He wants us there. He wants us to join Him. That's why He reveals Himself. That's why in His Word He calls us to open our hearts and our minds to what He is doing so that we may see Him moving. Something beautiful happens when we do that. And the greatest thing is when we live generously, and generosity doesn't, you notice in the meaning, it didn't say giving of your money. It was very vague in what it was you were giving of. Maybe you're giving of your time. Maybe you have a particular skill set and you're giving of that. Maybe you are giving of extra money. That's awesome. Maybe it's simply sitting with somebody while they cry or while they talk. You can live generously in all kinds of ways. And those of us that call ourselves Christians, maybe you're like, I don't fit that category. Okay, you can tune out for a moment, but I encourage you not to. But if you call yourself Christian, follower of Christ, we are called to live a life filled with generosity. Not just financially, but with our time, with our talents, with everything that we have. We are to give to those around us, so that we may earn the privilege to speak the truth of Jesus. Because then we might have the opportunity and the privilege once again to see that life changed for Him. To see them redeemed, not because of us, but because of what God did through us. Because we were willing to be open and to serve. Christ came, took over our debt, and then forgave that debt for those that follow Him. He shows us the ultimate definition of generosity. Nehemiah modeled it by being like, hey, I'm going to forgive these debts so that our people might experience freedom. Jesus did the same thing on a worldwide scale for all those that would call on His name. We had a debt that was racked up by our sin. Every time I fail, it's a check mark in the debt column. Every time I sin and I do something that I know is against what God would desire, it's a check mark in my debt. And the great thing about Christ is that He came, born of man, wrapped Himself in flesh, and chose to live a life that we would have to endure so that we could look at a God and go, you know what it's like to be me, but because you are stronger than I am, you are able to resist. And because you resisted temptation and then died in my place, you were able to take on my debt and forgive it. Christ came and assumed the debt that we have for our sin. He became sin for us and then died. when it was our place to die. And then he rose again, saying, you no longer owe that debt when you follow me. You can experience true freedom from it when you follow me. That is living generously, giving of everything you have so that someone else might experience freedom. So here's my challenge. Here's my question for you. Are you living generously with what you have? Are you living generously with what you have? Have you experienced, here's another question. Maybe you're like, I don't really label myself Christian. So here's my question for you on that one. Have you experienced the generosity of Christ? He came and he died for you so that you could be free. Have you experienced what that looks like, what that feels like, what that means for your life, for your eternity? Father, thank you so much for an amazing day, for an opportunity to experience your generosity and to share it with those around us so that we could be free. Free to call you Father. Free to worship you with all that we are, unbound by sin. In your name we pray.